at the beginning of September, as one of the new people in the mission of the EU to the UK, which used to be called the Commission Representation, and now is a different beast altogether because it's one of the delegations of the European External Action Service. So it's a full diplomatic ambassadorship, if you like, but it's still in Smith Square in London SW1. And as Molly was pointing out in our pre-Zoom chat, it's very good that it belongs to the EU because it used to belong to Mrs. Thatcher and the Conservative Party, and let's hope that she's spinning nicely. Right, I think it would be nice if Molly would...
I was going to add to that, if I might, that of course Molly was a candidate for Westminster Parliament in the election in December 19, but because of our scandalous first past the post system, we only managed to return one Green MP in the person of Caroline Lucas, and we'll come on to politics later. So
Nigel,
it's very good to have you all here.
Mm.
What I was trying to pull up was the last Herefordshire to Europe newsletter, which gives a little bit more background about each of them, because of course Molly is Professor of Green Economics, and it still hasn't opened, but I'm remembering that. And Emilien has worked on environmental issues in the Commission and now has that responsibility in the delegation in London. And I wondered if it would be sensible for Emilien to start off by saying a little bit about his background in the Commission in Brussels.
Sure, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, before arriving here a month ago, I had been in Brussels for 12 long years. Started the usual Brussels path, one internship, a second internship, a third one. My first real job, if you like, there was for the Consumer Federation. So the British member was which you probably know. I joined the Commission 8 years ago. Mostly worked in DG Environment Directorate on waste shipments, and in particular on ship recycling. So the idea was to avoid the dismantling of large commercial ships on the beaches of South Asia and bring back that business to European shipyards if possible. And the past 2.5 years before arriving in London, I was in the central services of the Commission, the Secretariat General, where I was working on the European Green Deal, so part of the Green Deal team, more specifically on air pollution, water, industrial emissions, and microplastics and other aspects of circular economy. I'm originally from Brittany, yes, in France, and as I was joking with the organizers, I hope someday I can visit Herefordshire to check if your cider is nearly as good or not nearly as good as ours.
You'll be very welcome when you can come. And of course, Molly is going to claim equally good cider across the border.
Definitely. 247 varieties of apple, we claim.
Well done. I don't know how many varieties we've got in Herefordshire. But, anyone got that information to hand? No.
Loads.
Anyone know how many varieties of apple we grow in Herefordshire? Tom, that's into your area very nearly.
Yeah, I should know, but it was 30 years ago I worked for Bournemouth, but it's all in the Pomona. The Bournemouth Pomona, all the various
stuff. The Pomona, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's get on to the European Green Deal. I mean, this massive communication in, December last year, was it? December 2019, covering all sorts of issues, with proposing a law which has that come into force already? The new climate law, no, but it's been drafted, I think, and there's a whole range of stuff around farm to fork and energy and a whole range of issues which I can't now see because my screen's not working properly. But it's a massive communication an action plan, a first activity starting in March 2020 and running on through, quite a long period. So, Emilien, would you like to tell us something about just some of those headings that we talked about yesterday that we thought would be of most interest to people here in Herefordshire? The agricultural side, the food side, the energy side, and you touched a bit on plastics as well.
Yeah. So I can give you some main ideas about the European Green Deal and some of the stuff we've done under that. The Green Deal, if you like, comes from first the realization that the planet, and in fact us, are facing multiple interlinked crises. The climate crisis, there's a collapse of biodiversity, there's persistent pollution and depletion of resources in general, and now on top of that, an economic crisis. And it was also the realization for the president of the Commission that to tackle these multiple crises, we need a holistic approach, and acknowledging how complex the issues are and how they have multiple drivers, multiple impacts. And one could say that this is in fact a flagship policy of this new Commission that started last year. And in the words of President van der Leyen, the Green Deal is Europe's new growth strategy. And the aim is to cut emissions to the environment while creating jobs, improving people's well-being, caring for nature, and also very important dimension, leaving no one behind. What was proposed in the European Green Deal, probably the iconic objective was to become carbon neutral by 2050 for the whole continent. And that implies a variety of actions on different levels, if you like. On energy systems, of course, 75% of our green gas emissions come from energy production. On buildings still use 40% of our energy. And buildings is very interesting because you can renovate them with local workforce, you can reduce consumers' energy bills, you can reduce your country's dependence on foreign imports of energy. Other sectors would be industry. Typically, Europe's industry only uses 12% of recycled materials in their new products. Big potential for improvement there. Another area of focus for the Green Deal is nature, not only protecting natural areas, but restoring as well to the extent possible, and acknowledging the importance of biodiversity, not just to sustain our own life and economy, but also in fact as an end in itself. Another dimension is the improving consumer practices. And by that, we mean truly empowering consumers, meaning that the most sustainable choices, whether it's food, whether it's products, whether it's mobility means, becomes the easiest and the cheapest way, which is not always the case at the moment. The big focus on the Green Deal is on mobility, improving private and public transportation towards more sustainable, less polluting modes. And indeed, a big focus as well on food systems, from production to distribution and consumption. So indeed, almost a year ago now, in December 2019, the Commission published this Green Deal. It was published in record speed, if you consider that the Commission only started in earnest, I believe, in November, that was. And after this big communication, which is something like 20-25 pages, we had a string, we started to adopt a string of more specialized documents and strategies, if you like. The first one was in fact in March 2020, the Commission proposed a climate law. And the climate law would enshrine into European law the obligation to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. A big development 2 weeks ago is that we have further refined that proposal to say that by 2030, we should already have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 55%. And that's quite a major hike compared to the earlier target, which used to be 40%. Now, we were on a path to probably do better than this 40%, but still 50% in 10 years is quite a big hike. Another document we've adopted and published as well soon after that was the Circular Economy Action Plan. The concept of circular economy is already a few years old, And the idea is to move away from the way we produce things at the moment, which is very linear. Essentially, you extract something, resources, produce a good, the good is used, the good is discarded, often in landfills or burnt, most often burnt for energy or just incinerated. And the key idea behind a circular economy is to ensure ultimately that discarded products, discarded goods are reused into new ones. And all along the chain, the production, the consumption, you want to improve the waste of resources. And sometimes that's very complex. For instance, one of the key challenges we have is that before being able to use recycled materials into new products, producers want guarantees on the quality of this recycled stuff. They want to know what exactly is in that recycled plastics, for instance. Does it contain still harmful chemical products? And that, if you want, triggers a whole chain of things you have to think about. The traceability of the waste, where does it come from? The design of the original product. Could you avoid putting chemical substances in that product so that the day when it is dismantled, it is safe to reuse the components? And that has in turn triggered reflection on whole new concepts as well, such as extended producer responsibility. It is the idea that the responsibility of producers of goods does not stop once the product is on the market or once the product is not used by the consumer anymore, but it goes beyond that. There would be, the Commission has plans and has been pushing to generalize the idea that producers are also responsible for what happens to products after they have been discarded. So collecting them and treating them efficiently. That's a big push and a very difficult task. Now, indeed, I can focus on one of these headlines under the Green Deal, and that's the Farm to Fork strategy, which was published in May 2020. It should have been published a little earlier, but well, something happened, COVID happened, and there were relatively clear links between COVID and the health of our food systems, the reliability of our food systems. And so we waited a little before we published this strategy, which does acknowledge the effects of COVID. The COVID pandemic has shown more than ever the importance of a robust and resilient food system that is capable of ensuring access to sufficient food for citizens. But sufficiency is not enough, and the long-term strategic vision of this Farm to Fork initiative is that we transform the way we produce, distribute, and consume food towards more sustainability. You will find 27 actions in this Farm to Fork strategy, and some of them are relatively large targets. For instance, we want a 50% reduction in the use and risk of pesticides and sales of antimicrobials used in farming and aquaculture by 2030. We want a 20% reduction in the fertilizer use. We seek to achieve a 25% of EU agricultural land dedicated to organic farming, again for 2030. And then we have a whole range of measures targeting the consumers to promote healthy diets. We have these massive contradictions in the food systems. On the one hand, about 20% of food is wasted in the EU, and yet half the population is overweight, and a solid percentage is also finding difficulties in accessing food at least 1 every 2 days. So that's the kind of contradictions we have. Soon, now the next step, if you like, now that we have proposed that in May, a couple of things will happen. We're now expecting the Council, so that's the member states, to give an opinion on this strategy in the form of what we call a Council conclusions. And that will give us a better idea of just how far we can push on certain of these items to sense where is the resistance of some of the member states, where there is probably a more margin of maneuver to go quickly. It is very important, of course, because this is only a strategy, and when we start proposing actual legislative texts, there will be negotiations with the member states, with the parliament. it doesn't stop at that. The support to rural areas, if you like, and farmers does not stop at this farm to fork strategy. We also have a number of flanking measures, if you like, and typically that's improving broadband access in countryside through our European budget. I would say the main difficult point in that whole sector is to achieve some sort of not a balance, but to go beyond a trade-off between sustainability on one hand and food security and competitiveness on the other hand, and try and show that in fact these are all reinforcing each other. One aspect of the farm to fork strategy and these issues in general is animal welfare. There's quite a history on animal welfare in the EU legislation. In fact, Article 13 of one of the EU treaties recognizes animals as sentient beings. And we had a first legislation on animal welfare in '74, so a long time ago, on the protection of animals at slaughter. And what's happened over the years is an extension of the coverage of these rules to also look at the living conditions of the animals, not just the killing stage, but also the transport, for instance. A couple of achievements on that front. Since 2013, pregnant pigs must be kept in groups instead of individual stalls during part of the pregnancy. There are rules to improve the quality of the flooring surfaces. There are rules to increase the living space for these animals. There is a ban on certain practices, so typically tail docking for pigs is now banned. So it's been relatively incremental, and it's definitely not the end of the story and not a perfect situation, far from that. So what we have now started is what we call a fitness check. That's a bit of our technical jargon, meaning we have a holistic view at all our animal welfare legislation and see systematically how it can be improved. That will last for several months. There will be a big public consultation where everyone is invited to participate. Now, if you allow me, I've mentioned the ambition of the Green Deal, what it is about, the sectors it regards, every dimension. I'll say a few words on what COVID has done to that. Of course, since the Green Deal was published, the COVID crisis started, and there was a fear that the recovery effort, in particular to rescue industries directly impacted by COVID, would put a dent into the European Green Deal. But the President, Ursula von der Leyen, and the Executive Vice President for the Green Deal, Frans Timmermans, were very clear very early on, and they said that the European Green Deal remains the top political priority for the Commission. And in fact, you know this mantra, never waste a good crisis, and I understand that it was in fact at the crux of the core of a political argument recently in the UK. But there is the idea to try and make something out of this crisis. And the Commission does believe that the Green Deal not only was already our growth strategy, but the crisis makes it even more important to accelerate in that discussion. There is the idea that the new targets, the ones announced 2 weeks ago on climate, will further help to strengthen Europe's competitiveness, resilience, and position as a global player. It is seen by our leaders as an investment which will pay off eventually. And for instance, I mentioned how the renovation of buildings and also renewable energies need local jobs, jobs that cannot be outsourced to outside Europe to thrive. And of course, it's one thing to have big ideas. You also need the funding for that. You need the money to make it happen. And here it's a relatively good sign that the Council, the 27 member states, have endorsed the idea that 30% of our budget for the next 7 years and of our special recovery budget, if you like, will be spent on climate action. Now, when you hear that, the immediate question, well, is what happens to the remaining 70%? And here, even this remaining 70% of European budget will have to respect the do no harm principle towards climate and environment. And that's a principle in the European Green Deal. So 30% to directly support climate, and the rest of the 70% at least should not damage our climate effort. there will be a whole, it's a traditional way of working in the EU. A lot is left to the member states to implement, to see what best fits their local circumstances. And there is some sort of soft or hard soft peer pressure in the form of member states submitting plans on how they will use the money and how they would like to use the money and how they will reach the objectives. So there will be plans, recovery and resilience plans that the member states will need to submit to the Commission. And these plans on how they intend to spend this green recovery money will have to fulfill criteria, several criteria, including on green transition and environmental do no harm principle. And what the Commission will do is review these plans and compare them to the energy and climate plans of the member states. That's another set of plans where the member states have to explain how they will achieve their share of the effort to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And this comparison, on the basis of this comparison, then the Commission will say whether or not the funds should be fully given to the member states ultimately, but also we make recommendations on what perhaps should go better. So voilà, that's an overview on the European Green Deal, on some of the actions under that, and on the green recovery new dimension. I think I've reached the end of my time, so I'll be happy to take questions later on.
Emilien, thank you very much indeed. I think your presentation shows how comprehensive the issue of green policy is and how it touches every aspect of our lives. Before I bring Molly in, to invite Molly to make some comments on that and give her perspective on it from her involvement with green issues in Brussels as well as here, I just want to bring up one little illustration of the way in which green issues touch all our lives, because you mentioned buildings. We didn't particularly want to focus on that today, but Herefordshire is a very rural, very agricultural county, and apart from apples, we have lots of cattle and we have lots of sheep. And we have been busy over the last couple of months protesting for the maintenance of our high food standards. You mentioned animal welfare standards, which are also something very important for British people. And we have been lobbying to save British farming, where we were joined by a man called John Burt, who lives in Shropshire now, who's been pursuing a national campaign to save British wool, because it costs £1 to get a fleece off a sheep, but it sells for about less than 10 pence. And farmers have been recommended to bury their sheep fleeces, but it makes excellent insulation in buildings, and it's far better than man-made fibres, which still leave residues and so on. So he's pressing actually at the moment the governments in the devolved governments in Wales and Scotland and in Northern Ireland to make it part of local policy that they should use sheep wool for insulation, they should use natural wool for carpets and all the rest of it in all new buildings. So, I mean, there is an important local aspect to this whole area of protection of our environment and of our agriculture. Molly, would you like to say something from your perspective on what we're talking about?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that as a green economist of 20 years standing, it's really good sorts of things I was working on in theory being put into European law. And of course, when you see that as a politician, you're always sort of slightly upset that it's not quite perfect according to what you would want, but nonetheless, it's really important progress. And of course, the other thing that always makes you a little bit sad right now is that we're not actually going to be a part of this. So I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking about why that might be the case. And then I'll go on and talk a little bit, about my reflections about the Green New Deal and so on, because obviously I don't have the inside technical knowledge that Emilien has these days. So yeah, of course, we all know, and we argued this in the referendum, that EU law is the best law in the world on protection of the environment. And Jill herself worked on some of it, so she's responsible for some of this excellent law. And we can, the only advantage in getting old is that you can say things like, I can remember before we had this law, and we had filth in our rivers and filth on our beaches and, no constraints on farm effluent and all these things which were destroying the countryside that we hold so dear. and those awful practices were gradually ended during our membership of the EU. And a lot of people who campaigned for us to leave the EU considered all that a lot of red tape. And it's one of the things they wanted to tear up and get rid of. And I would say what they object to most is the fact that business will be constrained by social and environmental protections. In other words, the sorts of things that we value in our lives. And not a clean environment, I don't think clean's the right word, but let's say a vibrant, flourishing environment is one of those things. And it's the reason that brought me into politics. And defending that is one of the reasons I fought so hard to keep us in the EU, because I absolutely do not trust people like Andrea Leadsom and Owen Paterson and you know, the whole gang that were behind the Brexit referendum, whether they're in Parliament now or not. You know, the Tufton Street gang and all their hangers-on in the US or wherever, it's very clear what they wanted. And what they wanted was to rip up that legislation so business could just have a free rein to do whatever it liked. Now, when I was still an MEP thinking about the trade deals that are underway, the thing that pleased me most, and I talked to Barnier before, during and after this, was his invention of this level playing field. Because what we were begging him to do was to find some way to protect the environmental standards we've achieved, even once we were outside the EU. And that's exactly what the level playing field was designed to do. So no, it's driving the Tories crazy, because they say, well, we want our sovereignty. You can't tell us not to trash our environments if we want to. Well, that's the subtext. They didn't say that. But, you know, Canada doesn't have these rules on its environment. Why should we? And of course, the answer is because we're sitting there right on the doorstep of the EU, and they don't want us producing, as they would see it, environmentally dumping, you know, producing stuff to low environmental standards, therefore with lower costs, and then just shipping it into their markets. So of course they want to keep that out, and them keeping that out and insisting on the level playing field is is our best chance of protecting our environmental standards against the Tory trashers, I would say. And that's why, despite what we hear about it all being about fish, I think the big fight is still about the level playing field, actually, and about the way the EU is trying to constrain the race to the bottom that the British Tories want to go through. You can see that very clearly in Parliament now with the agriculture bill, because everything that the government said it was going to protect, they could have just put that in the agriculture bill, but they didn't. And my colleagues in the House of Lords, because obviously we have only one MP and two peers, which is a bit mad, but the two peers have been working incredibly hard to get protections in the agriculture bill, so that we will have high standards in agriculture and the environment won't be, environmental protections won't be undermined, and food standards won't be undermined as well. But why is that necessary? You know, that should have been automatic. That's what the government said. They said they would stick to the high standards. So anyway, that is the politics of the environment right now. It's the protections we had in the EU. Brexit was a deliberate attempt to undermine them. The sorts of things I'm talking about now with pollution and so on, but also climate, which was central. And climate denialism was very closely tied to the argument that we should leave the EU. So, of course, you know, we're coming to the crunch point with the negotiations now. I was deeply disappointed with Barnier that he allowed, between the big thing that changed for me between the May deal and the Johnson deal was that the level playing field was taken out of the legally binding political declaration, withdrawal agreement, and put into the non-legally binding political declaration. I hadn't realised that the government was going to say, oh, we're not going to stick to the withdrawal agreement either. So, you know, maybe it's not quite as bad as I thought, since if they're going to tear up any law, then it doesn't really matter where you put the level playing field. But nonetheless, I argued with Barnier about that at the time, and it's one of the reasons I voted against the withdrawal agreement, because I voted as a European, and I think that without the level playing field, Britain is a threat to European standards in all sorts of areas. So it was, I mean, I would have liked to vote against it anyway, but I felt I'm not voting as a Brit here who doesn't want Brexit. I'm voting as a European who wants to protect the high standards in the single market. Anyway, there's a long list of other policies that are at risk, which I don't need to depress you with too much. Obviously, neonicotinoids that kill bees, that the British government fought tooth and nail for farmers to continue to use, but the EU has banned. You know, they'll be back. Possibly ban on glyphosate, which looks like it's coming in the EU, which we won't have. Strict limits on antibiotic use, which I negotiated myself with others, obviously. But, you know, no doubt we won't have those if we have a trade deal with the US, because they're totally permissible, as are growth promoters with US agriculture. REACH, excellent system of law on chemicals, and others. So a few things about the Green New Deal. So this is something we've argued for as Greens for a decade, and the idea that when your economy is in trouble, you use that moment to transform your economy into the sustainable economy we need for the future to tackle the climate emergency. To me, that's just so obvious. And so I could never really understand why people would say, oh, look, a health crisis has come, so we can't now afford to invest in green jobs. It seems to me it's the opposite. We're facing recession. Now's the time to invest strongly in green jobs. It's great to see the EU doing that. Of course, it's a real shame that at the British government level, it's just a slogan. There's so little backing it up in terms of investment. And we need £100 billion a year for 10 years, we estimate, to make our economy fit for the climate emergency and for the biodiversity crisis. It was interesting listening to Emilien, because this is one of the reasons I think people say that Europe's not democratic, because it sounded like it was a completely technocratic and bureaucratic process. And of course, from his point of view, that's how it is. But I know that there was massive battling going on in the Parliament to make sure that the emissions target was brought forward and was increased, and even to get a Climate Act in the first place. So obviously, as my Green colleagues think it hasn't gone far enough. And as British Greens, we say we should get to net zero carbon by 2030, because if the world target is 2050, obviously as countries who've produced more carbon dioxide in the past and still produce a lot more per capita, we have to do a whole lot better than that. But still, when I compare what's happening in the EU and what's happening in the UK, the EU is just doing so much better. And that's partly because there are Greens there. It's partly because politics is more plural anyway. But I would also say that the green wave that's now flowing across Europe has put Greens into government in 6 countries now. Belgium was the latest yesterday. You're never quite sure whether you want to claim to be part of the Belgian government, because it might be very short-lived. And anyway, people will say, but we had to wait 16 months for that. So, but anyway, to me, the real prize is Germany, where the Greens are on, 20+% routinely now. So that they're already a huge influence on what's happening there, but it would be great if they were in government or even had a commissioner. That would really start to transform European politics. Anyway, I didn't want to go into the detail of the proposals, all of which, are good but not good enough. That's how you always see those things as a Green. But I did want to say there's a lot of politics going on there as well. It's the combination of extreme technical and legal competence in the Commission and pluralist politics in the Parliament, as those two as co-legislators, and obviously the Council as well. But so much of the nitty-gritty happens there. And I didn't want to be written out of history, but I also didn't want people to go away with the idea that the Commission is the thing that happens, because that's partly why people voted to leave, and it's obviously not true. Okay, just a few last points about how we're going to stay close to the EU in spite of the Brexiteers, I think, and I hope. If you're running any kind of business in Britain at the moment, why would you not follow European standards? So the REACH directive, for example, lots of business people came to see me since the Brexit vote, and they all said, well, of course, we're going to stick to European standards. They still want to sell things in European markets. They don't want to make things to 2 standards. Why would they do that? And so, in a sense, it's just pragmatic to follow European law. Even if we had a really fantastic, competent expert government and we were investing millions and millions of pounds in setting up separate legal systems to govern all these things, I mean, I'm saying that slightly, laughing into my sleeve because of the utter incompetence of our government. But even if they were capable of doing that, still, businesses would be much more likely to stick to European rules because they don't want to be following 2 standards. And so I think that's one thing that is going to still keep us close to European law, I think, and I hope. The second thing is on the climate, that we're co-hosts of COP at the end of next year with Italy. So, we're going to be working with a European partner. Be really hard and really embarrassing, I think, if, as the UK, our ambition and our targets and our policies are much weaker than what's happening either in Italy or in other European countries. So if we're going to continue to cooperate, with our European neighbours and partners, then I think that in itself has a sort of, it stops us slipping that back too much, I think. Although again, that's sort of subject to the government having any regard to our international reputation, which, you know, after a few later incidents, maybe it doesn't have. And then the third thing is another practical one, and that's about energy and the European Energy Union, which I think is sort of on the way anyway, not fully fledged yet. But I think about this from the point of view of renewables. Renewables is completely different from coal, right? You can dig coal out of the ground in South Wales or Poland and trundle it off somewhere else and stick it in a power station. But if you're talking about renewable energy, it's going to be in different parts of Europe at different times. And that's why the whole proposal for interconnectors was made. And this is, at first I thought this was a bit crazy actually. It's like massive cables joining up European countries under the sea. But on reflection, I think it's a really important way of managing the sort of energy resource that renewables are. So if I give you an example, I live in the southwest, so you know it's always windy here, and but you know the wind that we get off the Atlantic has already been across Ireland, hopefully generating a lot of electricity. Then it comes to us, then it moves across to Germany. That same wind system will generate electricity at different times, and then it'll be passed back between those countries by interconnectors. So we're going to have to be connected to tackle climate and to deal with our energy future, I think, I hope. So in conclusion, I think there are serious risks to the environment and to the countryside and to our action on climate. I think that this government does not want to take those things seriously and is genuinely committed to unpicking a lot of the progress that we've seen over the past couple of decades. But on the other hand, from a pragmatic economic point of view and from a business planning point of view, there's such a strong incentive for businesses to stay close to European standards, I think. And just a last more political point, whatever comes out of this trade deal, when I sat in the European Parliament, I would have had a vote on this deal. My European colleagues will vote on the deal, or you know, they'll vote for or against the deal that Barnier and his gang negotiate with the British government. But British MPs won't have a vote on that. And that's going to apply to all the other trade deals. So if the US wants to make a trade deal on with the US, British MPs will not get to debate that and will not get to vote on that. So all this thing about sovereignty and bringing power back to this country, it was, well, we know it was a bunch of lies, but I think in the case of environmental standards, it's going to take all our effort and all our struggle and all our pressure on MPs to make sure that we get those protections into law where we can. Because when it comes to trade deals, the government could just negotiate them away and our representatives wouldn't have any power to do anything about that. Thank you.
Molly, many thanks indeed. Before we move on, can I just ask a question, because you're in the academic field, what do you see as the prospects for research cooperation in this whole area? I mean, I assume there is already research cooperation between the UK and the EU, but how do you think that might be affected in the future, or will it be able to be strengthened so that we keep those links close?
Well,
on the whole environmental field, whatever.
The government could ask to buy back into Horizon 2020. Is that the right one? I get lose track. I think it is. Thank you, Jill. Jill's remembering, good. Which is the Pan-European Research Cooperation, but it would cost money and it would mean us being sort of tangled up in systems and structures that they're completely rejecting. You know, so things like Erasmus and Horizon 2020, we absolutely should be a part of those. We could be a part of those in a future relationship, but the government isn't prioritizing them. And they say they want to continue research cooperation, but I know lots of colleagues in universities who are being left out of bids now when they might have been leading bids previously. So this is going to have a really serious impact on research in all areas, including the environmental area. And I think the sort of more subtle point here, which seems to have passed by a lot of politicians, is the fact that as Brits, we had huge advantages in the EU. The English language has always been a huge advantage to me in terms of policy making. But also the fact that we were in there when the programs were designed, you know, we could set up the programs in such a way that our academics could then get more money out of them. And we could sort of direct and, you know, position the research priorities towards things that were research priorities for Britain and for British universities. And any ability to do that has already gone. And, you know, being in there at the start and designing those, and in many skillful ways, I think Brits made Europe work incredibly well for us. But the thing we didn't do was the propaganda. So nobody knew this. But yeah, I mean, academics I know who've been part of European bids are pretty gloomy, I have to say.
Thank you. Before I open it to the floor, can I ask Jill whether she's got any particular issues from your background, Jill, that you would like to put either to Emilien or to Molly?
Richard, could I ask people to unmute themselves when they want to speak, like Jill has just done?
Of course. Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
Thank you, Richard, for the opportunity, and thank you, Emilien and Molly, for some very thought-provoking points. Picking up on what's been said, I'd like to ask two questions, really, if that's allowed. One on, well, I'd like to make a point and ask a question. On what Molly was just saying, I was flabbergasted when I was leaving the European Commission at the beginning of 2018 to learn that 3/4 by value of all the consultancies that let for studies and for preparing law and so on went to consortiums led by a British firm. They are no longer eligible for that work. So that is a massive loss to the British economy, and it will mean that new ways of doing things will not be invented here. So, I mean, it's not just research. There's a very tangible consultancy business loss there. Molly, I would like to defend Emilien a little bit, not least because we never overlapped, but we both worked on ship dismantling. I think I did with his predecessor. Anyway, the point about the Commission leading things, yes, it's the Commission that puts things on the table. It's not really the Commission that ever adopts law, although it can adopt subsidiary law, of course. But for me, having had nearly 20 years in DG Environment, one of the things that I always thought that was very good about it was that the Commission wasn't elected, so that it could afford to take a very long-term view. And for an environment policy, that was quite important. And it helped to push member states to go further than I think they would if they'd just been reacting to the state of political consensus at the time. Now, I don't know how we're going to replace that push for the long term in the UK unless it's like by something like Citizens' Assembly. And I wondered if you had any views on that.
I think as a person who's always been interested in constitutions and political structures, it was I believed the Commission was an unelected bureaucracy before when I became an MEP even. And then I learned the sort of subtle process of European policy making. And actually, to be honest, I think there's been a lot of sort of synergies between Greens in governments and in parliaments and the Commission on environmental policy and also on tax policy, on various aspects of policy, because, well, I mean, I would say this, but I do think it's true that Greens are pretty expert as a group of MEPs, and some MEPs are not, just don't know much about their stuff. So they absolutely depend on the Commission and don't get so stuck into the policy making. But a lot of the things I worked on, it was incredible to have such expertise as there was in the Commission, but I think also we were pushing them a lot politically, and that's the way it should have worked. But the Commission is totally unlike the British Civil Service, and which is obviously under significant attack at the moment. And I think, to me, I always justified that on the basis that there was no executive really in the European Union. So because the council wasn't like a government, the civil service, the commission couldn't be like a civil service. But I'm not sure that can't really work at national level, I don't think. And in terms of the long-term, short-term point, my own view is that it's more about the multi-party system and the pluralist politics in the European Union that gives you that long-term perspective, because you're never really, as the European Parliament, for example, or even as the Council, you're never really having to go and face election as such and defend a 5-year record like you do in national politics. And similarly, you know, because nobody's got a majority, there isn't a government as such in the Parliament. On every single issue, you have to reach an agreement. You have to reach a majority. And most policies, by the time they're voted through the Parliament, they have strong political support. Maybe 70 or 80% of the MEPs will vote for them. And so we're committed to that for the long term. Nobody's going to go back on that. So that, yeah, so I think, I'm not sure it's really the way the Commission works that gives you that long-term perspective. I think it's the way all the institutions work together. And I mean, Germany, I think, has a great constitution, but I think there's still that short-termism built in, because in 5 years' time, you're going to have to go and face an election. So I don't think there's necessarily a way around that. But having a system where everybody supported something before you took a step forward brings buy-in in a way that you just can't have when you're swinging between one party and another, as we do in this totally outdated, in my view, two-party system in the UK.
Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Now, I thank you everyone else for listening so patiently. I hope that what has been said has prompted some questions. Who would like to ask a first question from the floor? No one's got anything? Chris. Oh, well, Chris had his hand up just first.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone. Molly, I'm delighted to hear, and I fully understand the message that business will not want to be making to two standards, so they will carry on making to European standards. But do you foresee that they will adhere to that once they are being undercut by American imports made to other standards?
I think that's where the level playing field comes in, because, and it depends obviously on the different business and where their market is, but this is the reason I like the level playing field, because it was requiring people to keep those standards to export into the European market. And unless, I mean, if you're a business that already exports significantly to the single market, you're going to have to meet those standards to continue to do that. So obviously it depends on the nature of your exports, but any business, and very few businesses are going to actively throw away a big export market like that. But yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to discuss this rationally, because I just think the whole global Britain thing is just absolute nonsense. I mean, there's nothing in it. You know, I saw one government minister really celebrating that some farmer was exporting cabbages to Malaysia. Cabbages to Malaysia. It just makes no sense at all.
It's ridiculous.
A low value, heavy product being sent, you know, halfway across the world. So, I mean, if I was any sort of export business, I would have torn all my hair out long, long ago, you know, because what are they supposed to do? I don't know. But if they're you know, because they may still face tariffs, it depends on the nature of the trade deal. But if they're intending to continue, and their main export market is the EU, which is the case for many, many producers, then I think, you know, they will have to continue to keep to EU standards. And after all, where would they sell the products to another standard? You know, are we going to have just British standards? Incidentally, the whole standards system is dominated by the Brits as well, or was. So, yeah, I mean, I can't foresee a future in which we start following American standards. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but why would that happen?
I think
Tony.
my question.
Oh, sorry,
really was,
Chris.
Sorry.
Hang on, Chris. Yeah, come back.
Quickly.
Chris, you wanted.
The question was really, in the event of a no deal, obviously the level playing field then is out of the window. Clearly, there will be tariffs in that case, depending on the good, it's a higher or lower tariff. But if people are being undercut at home, are they going to find that actually the only viable way of keeping their business going is to drop their standards to the ones they're competing with?
But let's imagine you make a sofa, you make sofas, and you sell, you export 40% of the sofas you make to the EU, and so you meet the sort of flammability standards, and then we don't get a deal, but you still want to export those sofas to the EU. You're still going to keep those standards, right? Or even if very cheap appalling sofas come in from the US, at that point the question is, do the British standards then decline to the US standards? And this is completely the crunch, and this is the same battle that happened with agricultural goods. And that at that level, it isn't about really what the producers decide to do, it's about what the government decides to do to defend those producers. And yeah, I mean, I would say all bets are off there, but it's extraordinary the extent to which the government has refused to listen to businesses making exactly these points. But we haven't yet seen cheap, poor quality goods come into our markets. So I'm not giving up hope yet. I think it will be a very brave government that abandoned, because the tariffs we're talking about in many cases would make goods, especially food produced here, like the cheese and meat produced in my patch, it will just not be viable to sell that in the EU. It would be a very brave government that let that happen, I think. Anyway, like a lot of things, we don't really know, but I'm trying to keep on the optimistic side here and say, yeah, I think the EU law and standards are good. Why would business people abandon them?
And there's a job for all of us to keep the pressure on our MPs to support those standards, I think.
Definitely.
Tony, you had a question there.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Emilien and Molly, for very interesting stuff. I think the point I would like to bring out further is the circular economy that Emilien mentioned, and how are there any ways that we in the UK can actually use that to overcome the problems that Chris and Molly have been discussing, which is the fact that the idea of our current government would seem to be to race to the bottom as soon as they possibly can. Now, we politically can't do anything about that. I'm afraid our local MP here in Herefordshire effectively has Boris Johnson shaped earmuffs on, and won't actually engage in any reasonable conversation as far as I can see. We'll see if we can organise that, of course. But it's a question of how businesses can be profitable is not perhaps the right word, how businesses can succeed using the idea of the circular economy, because that's what people want. And the Green Party, obviously, and the ideas of keeping things green, I think would actually, if the public were asked, especially David Attenborough fans, do you want to keep things green? I think the answer would be yes, overwhelmingly, from 80% of the population. So if we can activate the circular economy and show that it is a way of being sustainable and answering the questions both of profitability, but also of sustainability. So I think my question would be to Emilien, after all that, would be, how does the Commission see the circular economy and the way to actually promote that? And do they think it'll work?
Thank you, Tony, for this question. The way we see that work is first there's a big strive to make business understand that it is in fact in their interest. There's a real business case for circular economy. But if you're mentioning the UK, there are two things I'd like to say. First, on certain aspects of the circular economy, it's fair to say that the UK has been a leader, in particular on research, and in particular through European projects and their participation in research projects. There's one very concrete aspect of the circular or non-circular economy that could have big implications depending on where the negotiations go. And I don't want to touch too much on the negotiations, but it's the fact that the UK historically has exported a lot of its waste, including within the EU. And depending on what happens in a few months, UK could rapidly have an issue with the the waste it used to export, and it might not be able to export it. And that's the kind of things that, if you're optimistic, you could say that will prompt some accelerated thinking on what to do with all these waste and how to improve the sorting, collection systems to make it more valuable. There are some advanced economies who are extremely good at this. Belgium is one, the Netherlands is one. On certain waste streams, Germany, France are good. But anyway, in general, the circular economy challenge is one for all countries. It'd be fascinating to see, even just in 6 months, how the UK has positioned itself on these issues, because there are implications of the negotiations.
Thank you. I'd just like to put a word in for a company that I've mentioned before to most of the people here, that's called River Simple. They're in Llandrindod, Wales, which is not in Herefordshire, but it's not far away. It's just over the border in Wales. And their business plan is entirely circular. They are building hydrogen-powered cars. They're a sort of beta test at the moment. They've got about half a dozen of these things actually running. And it's built completely to be recyclable. And their business model is to look after the car from cradle to grave. So all the materials, where they're sourced, where they're used in the car, and then how they're recycled when the car comes to the end of its useful life. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I think we should support it as much as we possibly can. And hopefully their name and what they're doing might be repeated in Europe. I don't know, but it's a name, I think, to put forward and remember. River Simple.
Just to say a little bit more, I think Emilien's right to say a lot of this thinking actually started in the UK, and you know, saying circular economy is a very nice phrase, but it's essentially about not taking more resources than you need, not wasting stuff along the production stream, and not creating a load of waste, and making sure that waste products can be used again. So yeah, that theoretically that's what it means. But I think in Britain we did have some useful law here, like the landfill levy introduced by Gordon Brown, because the point, and then European law like the end of life vehicle directive, which says effectively that at the end of the life of a vehicle, it's the company that made the vehicle that has to pay for the disposal. And the same with the WE directive, which is a terrible name, but it does the same for your computer. So this was definitely thought of by Greens, which is like, stop, you know, block up the pipe. If you block up the waste stream, people are going to think about what they're putting into that waste stream. And so that's where the circular economy idea came from, effectively, plus saying that the polluter should pay, which is another very good European principle that hasn't been put back into our law. But I think the problem for business here is that the next step for a green would be to say, and maybe don't have so much stuff in the first place. So if you think about the waste hierarchy, it starts with reduce before you get onto reuse, and reuse would be the circular economy bit, and plus probably some recycle. And that's a little bit like the problem with the Green New Deal, which is it's a green growth strategy. So from the perspective of a green economist, is growth what we're looking for? You know, so it's not, yeah, I just wanted to throw those thoughts in, because really we should have a car that at the end of its life, it can be, all the components can be reused or composted. Fantastic. But it'd be better if we had car clubs and we didn't sell as many cars. And that's harder to make money out of.
Thank you, Molly. I know that Molly needs to move on to another meeting. So does anyone, I probably ought to draw it to a close there, unless anyone else is really dying to ask another question. In which, Tom, can you make it quick, please?
The black side, we have 4 years of a similar government with similar attitudes. And I just wondered, from Molly's perspective, how she thinks the best way to actually bring pressure on the government is. I mean, is it the Extinction Rebellion route? Is it writing to MP? Is there a strategy for actually having a very positive effect in terms of green policies on the government?
Look, these are not normal times. We're not talking about a normal democratic government here, and this was clearly the case when they prorogued Parliament. And I worked very hard to get a popular front at the last election. And unfortunately, Labour wouldn't get involved in that. And that's why we've ended up with this government. So to me, what's broken is our political system. And that's mainly about the electoral system. But it's also about the fact that we don't have a written constitution. So they basically can get away with anything. And we have this absurdity of a non-elected legislative chamber in the House of Lords. So when I have political energy to spare, I spend it all on constitutional reform, arguing for that, campaigning for that, Make Votes Matter, Electoral Reform Society. There's quite a lot of organisations that are doing that, because I think it's the crisis we're in is much more fundamental even than Brexit, much more fundamental than just having a bad government. It's about the fact that the constitutional settlement that was arrived at, let's say the last big change was 100 years ago when women got the vote. It was never a proper democracy, and it's totally failing now. It always depended on gentlemen's agreements. And if people decide not to be gentlemen, you're just lost. And that's where we are. So to me, the most important thing we must all do is fight for a real democracy. I didn't support Extinction Rebellion in their latest events because I'm not happy with their lack of a political strategy. And there are a lot of people in there who basically take a revolutionary position now and say, citizens' assemblies can decide, which to me is no different from all power to the Soviets. If you don't say clearly you believe in representative democracy, then you yourself are a risk to the democratic system. So I think we're in an emergency, we're in a political emergency. And the most important task for everybody is to stand up for democracy and to struggle for a better democracy. And I think in a way there's a positive side to this, because things are so bad everybody can see now, right? What the Tories always did very cleverly, I'm sorry I'm hacking off at them so much. I have a lot of respect for some Tories, just not this lot. But what they always did very skillfully was give people just enough to make it seem like things were fine. They've gone too far now. Everybody can see we need big change. So that's our job, to make sure we get a proper democracy in this country for the first time. We deserve it.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Molly.
Thank you very much, Molly.
There we are. You agree with me. Yeah. Even in Tory Herefordshire, you agree with me.
Yeah. Not many Tories here, I don't think.
No, just as well.
I want to say a very, very big thank you to Emilien and to Molly for giving us so much time this evening to go through these issues with us. Thank you all for joining us. And because this is agricultural Herefordshire, I'm going just to tell one little story to conclude. Yesterday evening at 10 o'clock on Radio 3, I was listening to a conversation about the cow. And it was about the cow in art as well as in agriculture, and just our approach to the cow. And of course the question of methane emissions came up, and the question was posed for the future of the world, is it going to be us against the cow? But we had one of the contributors to this discussion last night was James Eubanks, who's written quite a lot on agricultural issues, and he's a sheep farmer in the Lake District these days. And he said that actually we're very good at carbon capture and storage in this country, because a lot, when you look at the agriculture, it's how you do it is so important. And the grass and the soil catches a lot of carbon. And if you've got cows that are eating grass, it's better than cows that are eating soya that's been, from deforested Amazonian jungle or whatever. And he said he'd recently had a CCS analysis or whatever it's called on his farm, and they'd come out as less than zero because they were capturing more carbon than his animals were putting into the atmosphere. So there's hope for cows as well. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting. Lovely to see you all. Keep up the fight.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you.